Hi, my name
Hi.
is Monisha Rios. Thank you so much for having me on this amazing and important show. Yep, I'm a doctor of psychology, not a therapist, but more of a researcher type. I am a former social worker. I'm Puerto Rican. I'm a veteran. I'm anti-imperialist. And I currently live and work in Puerto Rico. My family comes from a tiny island called Vieques, and Vieques has a very important history with many important lessons for us to learn. So I've been learning them here while I build a community project aimed at supporting access to healthcare for people who live in the island of Vieques and another island called Culebra. And I do many other things too.
Why don't you tell us what started you on this path? What was your aha moment or the trigger to go down this path?
Which path? Um,
Starting not only your education, but establishing these, I don't know if they're foundations or clinics or what the format is on the islands.
okay. Oof. So I grew up poor, like most people, struggling to access things that supported basic needs. I was raised by a single mom, had a very involved dad, and enlisted in the military just so that I could have a college education. I was recruited as a child in high school, like most people who go in the military. So I through the experiences that I had while on active duty and afterwards as a veteran, trying to access um, physical health care, mental health care, experienced military sexual violence, witnessed military sexual violence, witnessed it in the VA healthcare system, encountered a lot of barriers within these social institutions that are trusted and supposed to be helping us all. I practiced as a social worker in a hospital while homeless. So I've had just a myriad of different experiences that have really humbled me and taught me a lot about how these systems work and what how we are placed within them without our knowledge or consent. Um, and then I started diving into family history after Hurricanes Maria and Irma devastated the archipelago of Puerto Rico, and it really did something to me inside that made me start questioning these systems even more. And this was while I was doing my doctoral research. I actually started my doctoral program while living in the homeless shelter in a VA hospital while working as a social worker in a hospital up the street. So it's just like everybody says my life should be a Lifetime movie, but
Right.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, okay, you couldn't make this up. You know what
I'm
I
like,
mean? It,
where's
it
my
would
script?
sound
I'm gonna
it
write a script.
well, if it were a script, it would sound contrived. You know what I
Right.
mean? It just would be like,
Yeah.
oh, please.
You're
And
like,
it's like,
yeah,
yeah.
and it would be a horrible B movie.
it
But
would be a really good documentary, though. Ooh.
Yeah, right?
Mhm.
So, like, as I was learning these things, and I was also in like undoing my own proximity to white supremacy, understanding patriarchy, understanding capitalism, and how all of these things work in the context of colonialism, and also really trying to get in touch with my own roots, and how all of these things work together to create the experiences that I was having and that I was seeing others have. So I chose to rematriate to Vieques in January of 2020, right before COVID started, right at the height of my dissertation work, and really dove into this exploration, really of self, but also of these systems, and then also what is colonialism and what are the impacts of colonialism on health in times of the climate crisis. So all of that put together has really led me to the point that I'm at now. Plus, having a committed healing process and going through the internal struggle of healing myself from all of these wounds.
Right. It's interesting because I think a lot of people that grew up or live in continental US are really unaware that colonialism even exists still. And a lot of the rest of the world is really impacted by it, not just US territories, but a lot of the rest of the world is really impacted by the influence of governance from afar and cultural appropriation. People that don't look like the natives and don't act like the natives coming in and staking out a claim on land. And I don't think most of America understands that. And I don't think most of America has a really good finger on the pulse of what it means to be conquered or to have your personality or your culture taken away from you, and what that does to people mentally. And I don't think a lot of people even really understand what white supremacy is. I think that a lot of people think, oh, that's those guys in the sheets, and I don't think that there's a really good understanding of that here.
Right.
Do you want to go into that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's so for myself, I'm what some people would classify as multi-ethnic or multiracial. But I wear light skin. I wear skin that is privileged by the system of white supremacy, and it's privileged that way for many reasons. And so for our interpersonal relationship to how we are placed within this hierarchical structure that was created a long time ago by people who just wanted to get rich off of it, basically, and maintain control over society. Um, yeah, it's hard because we know, to an extent, we know who we are and what kind of people we are, and then when we come face to face in a confrontation, that there's this huge thing that's acting like a puppeteer over society and creating these divisions and creating this animosity and privilege. There's a natural resistance to us realizing, oh yeah, we're part of this. We do have areas that we benefit from this, and we have areas that we are harmed by this, and then we have ways that we perpetuate this harm unbeknownst to ourselves.
Okay, I was just thinking of what you were saying incorporates so much with Russell Hoban and when he wrote this. People write books for children and other people write about the books written for children, but I don't think it's for the children at all. I think that all the people who worry so much about the children are really worrying about themselves, about keeping their world together and getting the children to help them do it. Getting the children to agree that it is indeed a world. This is a world. This is what one does. One lives like this. Maybe our constant fear is that a generation of children will come along and say, this is not a world. This is nothing. There's no way to live here at all. Makes me think about your dissertation. What do you think about that and the hierarchy of mankind in general, not just for colonialism, but for the next generation? Mm-hmm. And does that have anything to do with what your dissertation said? Because it did to me. And that's why I have this already written up, pulled up, because it made me think of, what did that bring me to? What have I read before that remind me of that? Is that just completely out of the box, or?
No. If in the, like, in my heart, while I was going through this whole deep dive to do the dissertation and really asking myself and asking the world really hard questions, like, why does white supremacy exist? Who ultimately benefits from that? How does that work with capitalism and colonialism and imperialism? But the quote that you just read, when we talk about the children and the world that is being created, and how, yes, absolutely, I think that these things work specifically to maintain a particular structure to the world that benefits a small group of people, and that children are absolutely roped into that. And it makes me think, honestly, of how I was recruited as a child. How young children are when they are kind of like introduced to the concept of militarism through toys, toy guns, movies, G.I. Joe, all of these things kind of groom.
Yeah, it's more of an indoctrination than an introduction.
That's exactly what it is. We're indoctrinated in the womb, and we're born
Yeah, how
into a
can we stop
structure.
that? I wonder how could we stop that right there? Because I always ask this to every scientist or person who's studying something who comes on this show. What age is too young for a child to make its own mind up, their own
Mm.
mind? When can we say, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think this looks like? I mean, I don't know.
It's basically a dog chasing its tail, though. I mean, the parents. The kids don't even go to school till they're like 5 a lot of times, and so you have the parents, and unless the parents change, they're not going to raise a different generation of children, and so on and so on.
But
Hey,
I
Monish.
wonder if there was a way. Remember when we talked to the neuroscientist and also Dr. Zahner, we asked, like, what could we do to teach children before they start school to even recognize that there's trauma happening in their house?
Well, you'd have to have the parents involved.
Why?
Because you can't just go into someone's house and take their children and teach them something. If you know what I mean, the parents
That's
have to be
also why, though. Why?
participants.
I'm also like Monisha. I'm like, excuse me, Dr. Rios. I'm like, why not? Why can't we? Who says so?
Because that's another bureaucracy altogether. It's called Child Protective Services, and they take children away from parents.
Well, I actually have a question for Dr. Manisha, and it's so during the pandemic, white privilege came into sharp relief because we all had a lot more time to sit and think about things that were happening in the world. And I went down my own rabbit hole where I just started obsessing on all things James Baldwin.
Mm.
And he had made a point, and he didn't articulate it like this, but it was sort of like a terrifying eureka that he's talking about how that basically he had intimated, and I can't remember how he worded it, but it was very conversational. He said, that white people are essentially obsessed with a conquest. As he is like older white men who have been convinced to blame people of color for their suffering, have this sort of urge to, go out and make a name for themselves. And I started thinking about what we're into, like as a screenplay writer wannabe. I haven't had anything produced, but I've had things close to being produced. Is the hero's journey. We're indoctrinated with this notion of a hero's journey, which every successful, whether it's Star Wars or Star Trek, Boldly Go or No Man Has Gone Before, the Lord of the Rings, the core concept of every successful story that really affects kids is based on a hero's journey, going out and not necessarily conquesting, but going on an adventure and having something to share of value or heft or worth. And James Baldwin said, that is a white cultural construct. Black people just want to be. We don't want to fuck with people. We just want to exist. And that was an incredible learning moment. And so what I wanted to ask you is, do you think the whole Joseph Heller hero's journey is part, I guess, of the indoctrination that you're talking about? Is that fair to say?
Yeah. And when we get underneath whiteness, and really start digging into the roots of the white supremacist system, it does come from Western European ideals. When I say Western European, I don't mean geographically, I mean like Western and European. So when you look at how the spread of these ideals occurred through conquest, and then how the ideals that generated the act of conquest, like what did these cultures believe about themselves that allowed them to take the actions that they took, to feel entitled to do it and to feel justified in doing it. And then how has that evolved over time into now? This is a really primarily first world imperial core mindset that people have, but it's a system of ideals, and it's a system of beliefs about self, others, and the world that also can be spread. So you have a colonizer mentality. It could be described that way. You could describe it as a white supremacist mentality. You could describe it as a patriarchal mentality, because you have the interplay of patriarchy, you have the interplay of white supremacy, and you have the way that the cultural narrative, the stories we tell about ourselves, that goes into feeding the maintenance of the power dynamics that come from those ideals. So I think absolutely, I agree with James Baldwin on that. When you look at pre-colonial cultures, when you look at the way that the more collectivist cultures, not so much the individualist cultures, operate, it is not about me and my hero's journey necessarily. That may be part of it, but it's viewed differently as part of a collective journey. And it's viewed more as a sense of responsibility, not as a sense of entitlement and domination. So yeah, I think like what's helped me a lot with wrestling with that, because I certainly had embodied that into the choices I made in my life. The way that I wanted to create my future was about conquest. It was like, I'm going to conquer my life. I'm going to build my empire. I'm going to be successful according to these norms, without even questioning where they come from or if they're even healthy. And having absolutely no connection to the socio-political economic reality that these ideals have created.
When you told me it's not my job to teach you about white privilege, that meant something to me. It settled in my bones in a way that nothing ever has, and made me start thinking and reaching out and thinking, why do I have to believe in all this? Okay, well, it's come so far that I've never really identified as a Christian, but you do whatever the things you got to do. And, but I'm not a Christian, and I'm not afraid to say that anymore. I'm also not a racist, and I will fight a motherfucker if they want to call me a racist. Come on with it, because they don't know what it means, but I do. Does that mean that everybody needs to agree with what I think? Nope. But is it okay to put up with what a racist is throwing at you? No. You have to acquire the knowledge to deal with these constructs. That's what interested me so much about you, and it's why you're here today. And also, some of the terms you learned, I just think they're amazing. Okay, the oppressor, and you can be like what John just said, because this leads into the first question that I had for you. How can you be the oppressor and the oppressed at the same time? Wow. Well, just take a little crack book, mofos, and you find out. But anyway, let me just tell you what I'm saying. I'm going to read it since I wrote it more eloquently. And when I get on the camera, I turn into like an idiot. Anyway, okay. So could you give us an example of what being an oppressor and the oppressed at the same time means? And how could someone easily see when this may be happening to them in their lives?
So since we started with talking about the system of white supremacy, we can continue with that theme to help us understand how the oppressor works by looking at, we are all white women, and we are oppressed by the patriarchy at the same time that we are positioned to be oppressors in the white supremacist system.
Got
So,
go ahead. Sorry, I'll let you finish.
So that's just one way that concept can be illustrated. Another way is myself. I'm Puerto Rican. I'm a colonized person, and I was in the military. So I was definitely put in the position to oppress other people, while I simultaneously come from an oppressed class of people on multiple levels. So it shows the complexity of humanity, that we all have the capacity to oppress at the same time that we are actively being oppressed by others.
And I think women are born into that position regardless of skin color, because we all experience the patriarchal society, and that's pretty much transcontinental at this point. It's like most cultures, women are oppressed, and yet the hand that rocks the cradle. It's like we are the ones that are tasked with raising the next generation.
And I'm sorry, Robin.
No, go ahead.
And even taking gender out of it, if we look across the spectrum of gender experiences, we can see, for example, going to the theme of colonialism, we can see how the LGBTQ plus population, to which I belong, is also colonizing the crap out of Puerto Rico and other places, and using their own experience of being oppressed as a social class to justify their exodus, for example, and then they're taking over and gentrification of other spaces because they want a safe space. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to create a safe space for yourself where you can live and breathe without worrying about hate crimes. But also, there is an absence of connection to how you yourself are displacing others and creating an unsafe space for other people. So that's another example of how the oppressed oppressor dynamic plays out throughout humanity, not necessarily just for women or just for any specific group of people.
Throughout history. I mean, you just this was like an aha moment for me. There's basically no difference in result between a militaristic colonization effort and missionaries. Whereas the missionaries think, oh, I'm doing them so much good, I'm saving their souls. And the military is going in for material reasons to conquer for their bosses, basically. But boy, they might come from a totally different mindset, but intent is irrelevant when the result is the same.
Right.
Really powerful statement right there. And also, I just thought of like, what was it, 2 weeks ago in New Orleans, where I'm sitting right now. There was a Puerto Rican man who walked into a Hertz agency and got in trouble and got the police called on, and the police took the agent's side because this person from Puerto Rico had a Puerto Rican driver's license. Okay, these people in the continental United States don't even realize that Puerto Ricans are American citizens. In today's world, they are that unenlightened. How on earth is that possible? What could we do as far as, I mean, and as far as what you just mentioned with missionaries? After the hurricane, we had everybody on from the weirdest, what I consider to be the weirdest religions, like Scientology and the Mormons, overtake our island and try to turn us all into that. No. Anyway, but they tried, and they did give us a lot of good stuff. So I'm not, they want to give stuff, that's on them. Well, it is. Anyway, but what I'm saying is, what could we do to maybe, because we can't educate little kids really young to teach them about trauma. Boom, because the system blocks us out. We can't tell all little girls, don't listen to what boys say because they're both basically full of whatever. We can't talk about things like, well, if you join the military, they're just going to want to steal your soul and you might get raped, but you can get a college education because you grew up in a poor family.
Here's the thing. It's like, if that's such a big selling point, and you said it was like a big thing for you is to get the education. It's like, what kind of society do we live in that we basically have to become indentured servants in order to get an education and better our station? That's a problem.
It's huge. It's so huge. And also, even once you're an academic like Dr. Rios, it's academics versus regular people, or academics versus this,
Well, now you're an academic elite. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It's like,
yes. And it's really profound. It's what can we do to make that better, Dr. Rios? Do you have any ideas for that? Now I will go on another deep dive. You can give me another hard answer. I'm ready for it.
I personally don't identify myself as an academic because I flipping hate academia. I hated it the whole time I was going through it. I promised myself, because when I was growing up, I'm a neurodivergent learner. I don't learn according to the system of capitalism. I learn the way that is natural for me to learn. And so I was categorized always as slow and stupid. So for me, going and getting my doctorate, number one, was about getting out of poverty, because we are told that education is a pathway out of poverty. If you get an education, you can get a good job and then you won't be poor anymore. Lies. And then also, we are taught that the only way to have value to society is through education. We are taught that Well, for my case, I definitely needed the help of student loans just to survive, to eat, to pay rent. And you all froze.
Oh,
So oh, okay.
I'm okay.
Okay, good. So um I think definitely academia is one of the systems of power within the colonial structure that perpetuates divisions within society, rich, poor, so on and so forth. So that way it keeps the power dynamics intact. And yes, absolutely, it maintains the privileges of the elite. It gives a mythology to people about themselves, like, oh, I'm part of the elite class now because I have a PhD. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a piece of paper. It's just some stamp of approval that a group of privileged, cranky, crusty white men decided to give on me because I spoke in language that they prefer. That's it. Yeah. So going back to the original question, I am also baffled by how we can create the level of social change that we need to be able to see an equal, equitable world where people can thrive and be healthy, and not have to live in fear of violence against their person, against their children, against their families. And I think there are certainly ways that, art is very useful for influencing, when we like, if we get into the nuts and bolts of the dissertation, like the psychological warfare aspect, art is an essential feature of psychological warfare. And it's one of the many ways that children are influenced into the oppressor direction. And so art can also be used as a tool against that. But now, especially with climate change, the rate of the accelerated rate of violence, particularly in the US, the open fascism, you can ask indigenous people who are the original peoples of the United States and elsewhere about US fascism, and they will tell you usually that it has always existed. For them, that has always been true. For us, it has always been true. It's just now blatant and in the face of the people who weren't the targets of it before, who were the
It's not
beneficiaries.
hidden. It's just not, they're not hiding it. I mean,
Right,
it's been given the stamp of approval,
right.
basically.
So now we have kind of a new scenario of, we can't really take our time, and take the slow route to creating change, because we have to ready ourselves to defend ourselves from fascism. And it's like, at least that's what I think of when I think of, at least with the United States, the US empire, the reach that the US has in terms of global control, like the 4,800, give or take, US military installations that exist around the world on all 7 continents in more than 160 countries, according to DoD's own data. You know, it's
But we're
huge.
the peacekeepers. We're just there to make sure everything's okay.
Yeah, no, we're not. We're the profiteers.
It's that's the mentality that just, it's like, who buys this shit? I mean, like, what do you really think we're spending all this money to go into these places and keep them peaceful? I mean, that narrative is so ridiculous, which is one instance where I think, the benefit of education teaches people how to think and how to decipher the truth. And I think it was Trump that said, we love the uneducated. Well, sure, because they'll buy this shit where you say, oh, we're going over there to keep the peace or whatever.
Well, when I was working directly with kids, something that they taught me is that they're innately wise. I think when kids come into the world, when people come into the world and we start as kids, we have with us everything that we need. And we're taught to ignore that, and we are taught to suppress
We're
the
socialized
goodness.
out of it.
We are socialized out of it.
Is
So
that a moral injury right there? Because I'm going back to your dissertation. Is that the original moral injury?
oh, that is a wonderful question. I don't have the answer to that. But
Well, I mean, your dissertation made me think a lot. And I have a lot of weird questions.
now I'm going to think about that. That's cool. I like that question because I think maybe people could certainly witness things as children that lead to a moral injury young. Absolutely. I mean, when you look at just the sexual violence that happens against children, of course, the way that fractures them internally and leads to, issues in their development. Absolutely. um, so I think that the involuntary indoctrination, as we learn and grow, once we recognize our power, we have the power to not be indoctrinated. We have a choice. Once we recognize that choice exists, then we work up the strength to make a different choice. Like every single day, I'm confronted with old indoctrination that comes up inside of me through a traumatic response or whatever. And then it's like, hold on, Monisha, sit down and let's look at this. Let's spend time looking at, why did I react this way, or why did I have this thought? So it's really about taking the time. And I think the hardest lessons are learned by adults because we have the most conditioning. So once we are able to see in ourselves, oh, I have a lot of work to do in here and in here to become the person that I really believe that I am and that I want to be, and commit to doing that work, just like you have, just like I have. It is painful and messy as it can be, but stick with it. And like, even now, as I engage with, because I can't escape the patriarchy as much as I want to, uh, and as I engage with males who are very much happy being indoctrinated by the patriarchy, it's like, okay, this is still a human being. And if I'm going to live with myself and be happy with myself, I'm going to still learn how to treat them like a human being while enforcing very strong boundaries.
Wow,
And
you just brought back the oppressor and the oppressed at the same time and how it feels. Wow. I thank you for that. But also you brought back, you have a choice.
you raised a really good point about where the US is right now. And when we look at how the US got to where it is right now, all of the stories of colonization are relevant, not just about Puerto Rico. It's never only about Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is just one example. So when you look at the creation of the United States, it all happened through the genocide and displacement of indigenous peoples. And Puerto Rico just happens to be one of the oldest existing like continuous colonies, and the Spanish were here doing it before the US was, right? So we can get into chicken or the egg type of things with that, or we can look at, okay, this is the character of the United States and has always been. So it's not new, it's not a new phenomenon. It is something that has consistently been um, glossed over in education. It has consistently been taught as a right, as an entitlement that U.S. citizens have, because we won, we conquered you, now we own you, and we're allowed to do whatever we want with you. Um, and I think for me, what I've learned over the years from indigenous people within the US who are actively resisting the ongoing colonization of their homeland by the presence of the United States. It's, I think, supporting indigenous struggle is one way of doing that. Supporting Black liberation is another way of doing that. Um, and listening to the analyses of Black and Indigenous people who, even if it's an anti-capitalist analysis, which makes a lot of people uncomfortable because of the narratives we've been told about, capitalism is God for some people. They look at it the same way as they look at Jesus Christ as a savior. But is it really? And, what is the history of that? So I think for the people who have reached a particular level of growing their own awareness, and Paulo Freire calls it, I can't pronounce the word, but it's like growing your consciousness, um, then that can help equip us with tools. Like as we have more conversations and we build more relationships with people, then we can help guide them toward a decolonial direction. But I think the point you raise about like we're in an openly fascist imperial state, And so we may have to shift our focus toward dealing with the most egregious acts of the fascist imperialist state, which to me is not it doesn't have an academic answer. It doesn't have an educational answer, because that would be too slow. Now we've reached the point of escalation to where we really have to think in practical terms of how are we going to survive this while we resist this? How are we going to make sure that the people who are the most targeted by this fascist imperialist state are going to survive this? We need safe houses. We need escape routes. We need,
So we're there. We
Yeah.
are there. We are way beyond talking about how this started. We're in the middle of, and this has really turned this conversation, but I mean, I think it's important because there's no other thing to talk about right now if we really want to stay alive as a people, because we're basically in a civil war, and I've noticed that mainstream and alternative media outlets are calling it slow civil war. It's really weird, but it seems like a good title for it. But what?
A friend of mine who moved abroad, who's of mixed race, and it was interesting because he sent me a message the other day saying, how can you stay there? It's like you're living in 1938 Germany. And I said, well, how could you leave and not fight? You of all people.
Right.
The United States spends more per person on healthcare than other high-income countries, but still has a lower life expectancy.
We have poor outcomes relative to other countries. We pay twice as much as any other country. We pay more and get less.
My platform was built on me talking about being in therapy and dealing with narcissistic personality disorder. I don't trust people with my information because I know I use other people's information against them.
Name brand Adderall is still available for $290 with insurance. It's the generic stuff that most people can afford that's running low. You have a productivity crisis with the slowdown in Adderall and whatnot. You have a literal healthcare crisis if people can't get blood pressure medication, diabetic medication.
These institutions' board of directors gets to choose who gets a liver, who deserves one, and why.
That's a common question to ask all transplant patients. Are you fundraising?
Are you saying environmental influences rewire the brain?
Whatever we do consistently will wire up the brain. Neurons that fire together wire together.
It's usually the folks that have the highest IQ who are most susceptible to developing serious mental illness. When somebody has a psychotic break, it's like a heart attack. It's like a brain attack. It takes a long time to recover from that.
They all took an oath that said, first, do no harm. I'm really fucking angry.
The policies and regulations in place by our governments place people in a position where either they're priced out, they're not allowed to do something with medical doctors, or something that they want to do is banned. So what it does is it forces people to start doing things on their own and learning things on their own. Anybody can learn to be a medical doctor.
We're taught not to see ourselves as part of a collective with a lot more power than the small group that created the system.